But that pressure, I think that it does kind of create a pressure of like, am I saying the right things, boss? You know what I mean? Which unfortunately has its own histories.
In a world that often pulls us apart, More in Common brings us back to what matters. Hosted by Gerren Taylor and Keith Richardson, this isn't your average podcast. It's a challenge to think deeper, question louder, and grow further. At More in Common, we work with NFL teams, tech companies, and professionals across industries to improve communication and foster compassion. And with a focus on emotional intelligence, we aim to bring a wealth of experience to help you navigate the complexities of human connection. We've never been more connected and yet more isolated. We want to explore the roots of that tension and offer a way back to what we all need: real human connection. Enjoy the show.
Welcome back. You know, you really fluffed my feathers the other day when you hijacked my open there, Cal. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh, last week and with Shy, when we were with Shy. Yeah, man. You know, sometimes you got to keep people on their toes. Like,
no, I get it. I mean, listen,
it's
part of how you do it. It reminds me I was watching the other day on socials the clip of Obama explaining how this meme of like the handshake where he's going down the line, he's like dapping up the basketball players.
You came in, I got the big dap, but like Mark Few got the Key and Peele,
Now,
the handshake. Is that you thinking that's like an accurate representation?
Here's what happened. I'm going down the row, right? A lot of those guys I knew.
For sure.
It's Steph, it's LeBron. I've been knowing those guys forever. Coach Few I'd never met.
And so he's explaining kind of how that took place. And really, it comes down to how well you know somebody in some ways. He was saying that he had existing relationships with some of the people, and then, on the first official meeting, you're not going to get all in somebody's golf. But it also really did expose one of the things that I think happens so often in our society around how we move between groups, especially in the African American community. I think it's pretty well known, like the idea of code switching.
Yeah, that's a thing.
Yeah. I'm sure you've had your experiences with it as well.
I
mean, they call you the Alabaster Homie. I heard that in college I
wore a shirt at one point. But it's an interesting. Like, I think the handshake piece of that is such just a reflection of what it means, right? And how it can manifest itself. Like, just from a sociological and psychological point of view, or a social psychological point of view, that we look to figure out how we fit in different spaces.
Yeah.
Right? Like, when you think about, well, first, before we even do that, for you, what is code switching? What is it?
Well, I think it's about how people adapt to what they think is the right way to communicate in a certain environment. Like I was mentioning earlier, in the African American community, it's pretty like there's like the speak that you have with your friends, and then there's like the work speak. You know what I mean? So like the "what up, homie" versus the "hello, how are you, sir," is a pretty broad example or a really bright example of code switching. However, I think there's also some more nuanced cases where that occurs, like how people approach situations when they like puff their chests out a little bit, you know what I mean, to try to appear more macho or more strong than they may be feeling at that moment, but the appearance is part of it. So I think it's both in language and body language.
Yeah, it's that navigation of self through different social ecosystems. What I find interesting is it's often based on our assumptions of what's expected in those spaces, right? I mean, we've talked about removing assumptions before. When we make those assumptions, what are we doing? We're creating a judgment. Now, underserved, minority subjugated communities tend to be negatively impacted by code switching more than dominant cisgen white men, right? And a lot of that has to do with why we code switch, right? And what it ultimately means. Because hey, we haven't said it in a few episodes, or at least we haven't said it recording because we didn't talk about it with Shy. Survival,
Yeah.
right?
No, absolutely.
Like, how are we adapting to our environments? And this is very much a social survival mechanism. It's necessary to present yourself as not a threat to the ecosystem that you're entering into, right? Like
Exactly. Yeah.
it's there used to be old, I don't know if it was Western or 1400 1500 England, Western European type ecosystem, the whole element of elbows on the table and where
Yes.
that comes from.
The manners of this. Yes.
Right? Like, elbows on the table were a demonstration that you were an outsider in this space and that you pose a threat to the people of said pub that you might enter into because you're not part of that community. People don't know you. And if you come from a place where elbows on the table is a normal thing, and then you show up to a space and just show up as your normal self with elbows on the table, now all of a sudden you're a threat to the people there and you don't know it, right?
Right.
Hypothetically speaking, and now they consider you a threat based on their own norms and social ecosystem, and you're just like, wait, what's going on, right?
Well, I mean,
So go ahead.
it's exactly what you see in immigrant communities in this country as well, right? Like the necessity of code switching in certain environments or adapting to the dominant culture's behaviors in order to fit in, to feel more welcome and not stand out.
And it's so complicated. Like, if we think about it just from a social perspective, because we are so blended in our requirements for survival, right? Like, from a evolutionary historical perspective, if I left my tribe and went to your tribe and I didn't accommodate your customs, or I didn't acclimate, or I didn't, in some form or fashion, like integrate with your customs, I would be rejected from your space.
Right.
But then I
Right.
could like theoretically go back to my own space where my safety is, and I don't have to go ever to your tribe again. Whereas in modern society, we don't have that luxury. We share neighborhoods with people who otherwise wouldn't be in our tribe, quote unquote, right? Go ahead.
So I want to ask you, because this kind of presents the duality of the situation. The almost bigger question that I do want to get to, and we'll talk more about it later on, I'm sure, but like, what does one give up from part of their tribe, or is it overall beneficial in some ways? Because I think that, and again, this is particular from my lens and frame and experience, part of the pushback that sometimes African Americans get within the African American community itself around code switching is you're acting white, or you're giving up some sort of part of your culture identity in order to assimilate or fit in. And the positive kind of like negative give and take of that, I think, is also an interesting point that we should touch on before we get out of here.
Yeah, I think that's like, there is something visceral about that. If let's say you have a big family, or any family, and your kids leave the house and they live with another family, right? And then they follow the norms and mores and the values of that family. As the exiting family, that is wildly painful, right? Like if you just boil it down to that, it's wild, it's difficult, it's painful. No one wants to see someone that they have integrated as one of their own leave to go be somebody else's, right? And yet we do it all the time culturally. Some people move out of the United States to go live in a different country because they choose to. So what do? They assimilate to the cultural values of said place, and vice versa. Like people come here and assimilate to the cultural values of the United States, whatever those are these days. I honestly don't know. They're all over the map, multicultural landscape. It's a very it's a very mixed bag. But there are certain things that you assimilate to, and you bring yourself and you indoctrinate yourself into that space.
Mhm.
That's a social balancing act, right? So we all do it. I think where it gets really complicated is the introduction of the economic engine that is the core to all of our survival in modern society, right? Like, we talk about code switching as a mechanism of our own survival as we enter into a space, right? Basic handshake is a great example. From my perspective, what I don't want to do is like, hey, look, we do the hug, we do the handshake, you do the whole thing. You and I do that. I do that with Rodney. If I'm on the street and I just meet another black dude, right? And I do that, there is a potential perception of me just doing it because you're black, because that person doesn't know any of the context of all of my relationships. Versus if you introduce me. But even if you introduce me, there's still a firm handshake that goes into it, right? Like you kind of got to feel it out. Like, are you like, where are we at here? And I've even done this with white people before, where I go in full on. I did this in St. Croix on our honeymoon with the owner of the resort that we were staying at, and he goes, yeah, I don't like that. And I was just like, oh, okay. This is just, I didn't know people didn't like doing that. And then like my training partner, he's become a good buddy. When we first started training, I did that like one day, and he's like, oh, so we're doing this. I'm like, oh, I didn't realize you were uncomfortable about that. Right. Like it's this weird thing, like how it's so individual that it's difficult to suss it out. But going back to the point of the economics, our survival is based on the money that we earn. Now, who has defined the access to that historically? It has been predominantly the white men throughout the course of Western capitalist growth. Facts. This isn't some controversial statement. Well, that then permeates the culture of those economic spaces. So if I have a very successful economic space and I have defined what it means to be professional, quote unquote, or to have executive presence, I have my own perspective. You, as a black man, I'm just using you, avatar it for a second, right? Coming in maybe without that exposure growing up, because you grew up in a different culture, a different environment that didn't go into the same professional spaces, hypothetically. All of a sudden you're entering in that space and you have to dramatically change based on your perception of what is expected of you. And that emotional tension, because now me as a successful business owner in this avatar thinks you should behave a certain way, whereas I'm actually getting less of you because you aren't being entirely you, simply to adapt to the space that you think I need and that I have established boundaries around that says this is how you are supposed to behave.
And that's exactly kind of what I'm hitting on, because it does create some levels of stress for the person experiencing that, like the loss of their own self-identity sometimes in these spaces. But that pressure, I think that it does kind of create a pressure of like, am I saying the right things, boss? You know what I mean? Which unfortunately has its own histories.
It has its own
Yeah.
connotations there, eh?
Which,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
but it's part of the reality of living here. For instance, like you were talking about Americans living in other cultures. I spent a lot of time in Mexico, and it's very different, especially in a border town. Because yeah, people who are selling stuff will come up and they'll be like, "Hey, my brother, what's up?" Like it's 1970s, right? But it doesn't have the same kind of weird, like you were saying, as you would approach like a random black, you know what I mean? Like it doesn't,
Yeah.
and that it doesn't feel as culturally misplaced in some ways. So there's not as much of that racial history and all that jazz that's happening
Right.
when they have this in America. And so the kind of natural nuances to that level of code switching is even more, not complicated, but it doesn't feel in the same, but it doesn't feel in the same way like a negotiation for access to survival as much as it is for the social fitting in part, right? Like,
Right.
and I
No,
think
it's a
that's
no, go
well, I'm
ahead.
just saying that's the distinction I was trying to make about what's happening in the American kind of cultural zeitgeist of how we experience it versus the larger kind of social navigations of it.
Yeah, it's so interesting, right? This element of this natural, and when I say natural, I like to call out, like I'm hesitant to say this is just a human like this is a human characteristic, our adaptation to various social ecosystems to make sure that we fit in for our own survival, and the application of safety from other people, right? Like I am entering into this space for my own emotional safety, maybe because I value it more, but I want to gain safety from you. In a social setting, it's easier to navigate. It's like the owner of the place in say on my honeymoon, right? Like, oh, okay, he doesn't like it. I'm fine. I just won't do it again, right? And
Lesson learned.
we'll determine the connection that we establish based on the acceptance of each other in those differences, right? Like finding commonality, and we've talked about this briefly a way long time ago. Um, Learned this from an organization that does a lot of conversation, is that to find commonality, we have to navigate our differences. Like we have to put them out there. We have to be okay with it so we can understand and accept without judgment those differences. And it's that judgment in between that creates the separation. So now let's take this a step further into the economic space. That judgment as a person that might have to acclimate so much of their identity, right? I mean, this is why hair and allowing people to have the expressive hairstyle of their choosing is so important in the professional space versus everybody has to have the same haircut and it has to look like mine, right? In order for you to be accepted here. That tension is so high because it's not that I'm looking for safety from you. I'm looking to navigate the ecosystem that I'm a part of. I need this relationship because this is the job I have right now, and I can't afford to lose it. I have to feed my family. I have to do this. Sure, it's wonderful and it's rose-colored glasses to think of the luxury of, yeah, just go find another job that accepts you for who you are. But that is a wildly difficult proposition. You're not
Yeah.
guaranteed to find another job, right? You're not, you could go look, but that's a full-time job in of itself. And if you have kids and if you have 2 jobs or 3 jobs, like it just becomes increasingly difficult to separate from that necessity. So what do you end up doing? Giving more of yourself. right? It is not and that's where code switching in a professional sense becomes so destructive. Like, it's easy for us to think about this from, sure, a human perspective. We all do it, right? We all do it. But then what are we doing to allow people to bring themselves into the space
Fully,
without
absolutely.
having to code switch? How are we being honest about it? Telling, hey, that's not for me, right? Or even saying, look, I accept that thing that you do, but I don't want that particular reflection in this space, and here's why. This is what I'm trying to convey. This is, as a business, this is the brand we're trying to put forward. So I want you to be who you are here, but maybe channel that over here. We all do that within a corporate space. But again, it comes back to who's setting those parameters,
Yeah.
who's
No.
making those rules, and how reasonable is the argument for
And
those rules,
and
right?
not to get too tangential, but you mentioned the haircut thing, and it just, it brings up to me like the constant struggle that the United States military has with its very diverse ranks. Like, some people's hair grows out of their head literally different. And so in order to have these uniform standards about how that stuff works, there needs to be, an understanding between, because that's not specifically code switching because it goes to like actual physical traits, but it is something that I think is part of how this in-group out-group stuff works, and who's in charge of making the regulations and what that standard is, and how that seeps into so many other spaces in our lives and forces us to code switch. Which brings me to my next question. Like, you mentioned being a cishet white dude, which I don't think anybody, we all know that about you. It's not a secret. How does it show up for you? Like, I know that you probably don't necessarily always feel the quote unquote obligation, especially in professional settings, because your, natural being is probably considered the standard issue, right? Like, the culture that you grew up in, you're a Midwestern guy. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. No, it's a really good question, because you're right. And all that means, right, is that standard. And this kind of goes into the default standard of acceptance, which is generally whiteness, right? Like, how do I be more white? I don't have to do that. I just show up, and how people perceive me is based on their own biases and all of that. But I check a lot of boxes, right, of what would be safe. And it, for that, gives me a little bit more flexibility. However, where it doesn't, like, where I struggle, is that in those boxes that I check on the positive, I also check on the negative,
hmm,
depending on who I'm talking to.
uh-huh.
Certain demographics, certain personality types will look at me and just think I'm a bro, right? And then either they won't like, I have to adapt my being to overcome their perception that I'm just a bro, or I'm a meathead, or whatever it is. Like, I check those boxes too. And I've struggled with that for a really long time in my life, because what that means is people might not think I'm smart enough. They
Mm.
might not really seek my opinion, or I have to work a little bit harder to get the attention to break through that. Um, the way I have ultimately broken through on that is by just being myself. And it's taken me a long time to feel comfortable with that, and ultimately allow their judgment of me to be their problem, not mine. And that is also challenging. I'll use a job interview that I recently had, right? I have a technical background. Like, in certain capacities in my roles, I have a technical background. If you ask me questions, I will be able to navigate a certain conversation with a certain level of depth around enterprise level technology. I went through an interview process that kept telling me they need someone who's more technical, but they never defined it. I interviewed with 4 or 5 people, and not a single one of them asked me a technical question. There is a perception of me that I wasn't technical enough, and there was no validation of that detail. Like, I had to, if I didn't get the job, because to get that job, I had to go even further to validate it. And for a variety of reasons, I just didn't do that. And thus that's not the only reason I didn't get the job. And I don't want to just put it on that, but I know that was a massive component of it, because I actually had to ask one person, how are you going to vet whether I'm technical enough? And that person went, oh, good question. Let me ask you this question. Right? Like, so where are we at here? How are we how do I need to show up? I actually used to wear glasses because I got LASIK, but I used to wear glasses in professional spaces for the better part of a decade, because I don't look 43 years old. When I was 35, I didn't look like I was 30. So then I'm talking to C-level executives and other, executives in these spaces. Like, I've got to show up a different way just to break through their judgments and perceptions of me.
Yeah. I mean, code switching is not just a black and white thing, right? Like, it's class, culture, sexuality, ability. And I think it's such an interesting perspective too, because, we often don't hear those stories. We often hear the other sides of those stories too, but it's nice that.
Yeah. And I don't want to, and I think it's important not to even oversell it insofar as it's, okay, so I have to put glasses on, right? Like, the effort in most of the spaces is not that daunting. It has been at different points in my life, right? I'll use a recent example too. This came up in a call. I'm trying to develop this. I want to be very careful as to not identify the nature of this, but I'm trying to develop this business relationship.
Okay, I thought we were getting state secrets though. All right, never mind.
And it is very clear in this conversation where I started with it to say, okay, let's get to know each other, right? Like, let's just get to know each other. I carry a very personal interest in people. Now, I don't need to dive into a what's your life story conversation in professional spaces, but I want to know you. I want to know who you are. I want to know where you're from. Do you have kids, right? All that stuff, or at least to the level that's HR friendly. This person clearly, I think, comes from from some point of view that made that conversation wildly uncomfortable. Okay. So I then had to put my professional hat on and be more professional. And I am not a professional person. That is a hat that I have to frequently put on in certain spaces. At the same time, I also recognize, like, an individual like that who might not be super comfortable in that type of environment where I thrive. If they want to come to my level, they're going to have to code switch themselves, right? But I also, again, going back to the lift, right? The effort will be different for you because you have to overcome so many other points of view, and you have this much leash, whereas I have this much leash.
Yeah, and I think that's really what's interesting about how we have these conversations, because the more we talk about it, like, I feel like, having heard your side of it, like, I get more of how you have to navigate, right? Like, maybe you love working out. You are in some ways kind of a meathead, but you don't get to talk about.
But you don't get to tell me I'm a meathead. Like, you don't get to treat me like that guy you think is on TikTok going, right? Like,
but and so that is an important part, and it brings up the question, like you're saying, what else are people leaving out? Why aren't we working on creating spaces that are, and I know I don't want to use buzzwords, but inclusive enough that you can come with your whole person and feel comfortable being what that is? And I think this is why we always talk about diversity being such a strength, right? Not just at the potluck when there's tamales and pierogies and adobo, which, now I'm hungry because that's a great lineup. but also people authentically bringing them whole selves, their whole experiences and their perspectives to bear on a problem is what's going to allow it to be solved better, more efficiently, I think, and with the best types of outcomes, rather than having, creating so many winners and losers, as society is wont to do.
I think this conversation needs to continue, G.
Yeah. All right. We'll break this one up then, and we'll talk more about the navigation of code switching in complex societies like the ones we live in, because I think that's something we should talk about too. Like, how
I think you just landed on a point relative to bringing whole self, and we're heading in this place of, okay, thanks, but now what? And that just opens it up to a lot longer of a conversation. So for the purposes of our audience, this doesn't end here. Tune in next week, because we are going to keep this rocket going. I can't believe we have talked about it for a half hour now. And there's just more to say.
There still is more to say. This is the More in Common podcast. I'm Gerren Taylor, and that's Keith Richardson. We'll do this again next week.